Hey guys, welcome back to this lecture, remote write versus remote read configuration. In this lecture, we will learn about what are the remote write and remote read configuration in Prometheus, how can we use it, and also what are the different attributes that defines the properties of these two APIs. Okay, so we'll quickly jump onto the theory here. So the very first thing about both remote read and remote write are whenever you set up a remote storage, there are two kind of APIs that comes into the picture. One is remote write, where you write the data from Prometheus to the remote system or remote storage, whatever you are using. And in case of remote read, how Prometheus will read the data from your remote storage if it wants to check the historical data. Means now suppose what you have done, you have implemented a remote storage, okay, and there you have set up the retention of 6 months, okay. And at the Prometheus side, what you have done, you have reduced the retention because you don't want to replicate the data at two sites, right? Because you are managing the replication and everything at the remote side, you don't want to manage it on the Prometheus side. So what you have done, you have reduced the retention of Prometheus storage, like retention of Prometheus to let's say 7 days, so that for the last 7 days data you can check in the Prometheus console very frequently, okay. And your alerts and your dashboards are working on those the latest data, right? So that's a retention configuration you have done. Now it comes, what if you want to check the data which is 15 days old in your Prometheus web UI, okay. So that's where remote read comes into the picture. So now using the remote read APIs, you can read the data from your remote storage system inside the Prometheus. So it's a two-way communication, okay. In case of remote write, it will go from Prometheus to target storage, that is the remote storage. And in case of read, it is the it is the flow from the remote storage to the Prometheus system, okay. Now let us come on to the configuration part. So on the left block, you are seeing remote write here. In the remote write, the very first thing we need to specify is the URL, which is your write endpoint, okay. Now suppose in our last lecture we have seen for Promescale, our write endpoint was Promescale, the container host name, whatever it is, colon, the port number at which it is listening, let's say 9201 it was, and then slash write. So it is one endpoint for the remote storage, remote write, okay. Now the next is remote timeout. Remote timeout basically specifies, okay, if your remote storage is not reachable till 1 minute, then it will be considered as timeout and you'll get the exception for the same in the Prometheus, okay. The next is follow redirects equals to true. Now what we are saying here, if there are any redirects set up in between, so it will follow the same and will reach the destination. The next is enable HTTP2 and it is set up as false. What that means, there are two protocols for HTTP 1.1 and the latest one is HTTP 2. So HTTP 2 use some mechanism which makes the transfer of data very frequent using a different methods in the backend. Like it compacts the headers better than the HTTP 1.1 protocol, which makes the header size smaller, and in the results or in the accordingly your transfer rate increases, okay. So this was about enable HTTP2. Now the next thing we have is the queue configs. Now you'll say, what are the queue configs, because till now we have not heard about it. So let me make you understand this using an example. So what happens in case of remote write here in Prometheus is, when you set up your remote storage, okay, and you enable the remote write API in the Prometheus. So what basically happening is, the val file where the data recent or say last 2 hours data is written, from there data gets write to the remote endpoint via the shards. Now what is shards here? Shards are nothing but the logical groups where Prometheus uses a concept of distributing the targets, okay. Let's say you have multiple targets, so what Prometheus does, it distributes the target into different shards and then controls the data flow in a frequent way, okay. So sharding is nothing but logical groups of target system from where data is coming, and this is the way with which Prometheus handles the transfer of data, okay. Now from write add log files to sharding, every shard is mapped to your write-add log files using a queue. Okay, queue is like the medium between write-add log files and the shard. So the data transfer via this queue. Okay, so every shard has one-to-one mapping with the well. Okay, now one-to-one mapping with the queue, I'll say, not the well, because in our case sharding can increase up to the maximum number of shards which you have configured in the configuration, but your well can be lesser. So it's not necessary that number of wells will always be equal to number of shards. Okay, so now what is happening, as soon as data comes into the well or write-add log files, data starts transferring from well to the different shards using the queues. Okay, and then from those shards it gets returned to the remote endpoint. Okay, now let us come back to the last slide. Now in the queue config, we are basically specifying those configurations. Okay, like how the data will be processed from your well up to the remote endpoint. Okay, now the very first attribute inside queue config is capacity, and we have set it up here as 10,000. So what capacity means, now here capacity indicates how many samples are queued in memory per shard before blocking reading from the well. Means per shard how many samples are queued. Okay, number of samples that are queued per shard until it is blocking the well. Means now suppose in our case we have set up the 10,000 capacity here, means per shard per queue 10,000 samples can be queued. Now once this amount reaches for all the shard, then reading from the well gets blocked, and once the reading gets blocked, no further data is appended to the shards. Okay, so at that point data transfer stops here. Now that this usually happens, now suppose your remote storage gets unresponsive or gets into an outage, so what happens, your data keep accumulating inside the queues, and at the point where this capacity threshold reaches, the further reading stops here. Okay, so this is about the capacity. Now the next thing is maximum number of shards, or max underscore shards. It basically specifies what is the maximum threshold of shard that can be created inside my Prometheus system. Okay, so now suppose if you have a larger monitoring system, like where you have multiple targets, a lot of targets and everything, data is really huge which is flowing through your monitoring system. In that case, number of shards usually increase so as to accommodate or handle the data uh, accordingly. Okay, the minimum shards is the minimum number of shards that you want your Prometheus to create. Okay, now maximum samples percent. Now what is this maximum samples percent? Number of samples that can be sent to any queue percent in a request. Okay, so that is, we have set it up as 3000. You can change it as well as per your monitoring system. Next, suppose you have batch send deadline. Batch send deadline basically says, or it sets the maximum amount of time between sends for a single shard. Okay, so for a single shard, if you take an example, what is the time difference between two sends? That is batch send deadline. Okay, so that deadline is 10 seconds. So within 10 seconds the second request goes. Minimum backoff means the minimum amount of time to wait before retrying a failed request. If any request where it is sending the samples to your shard, if it gets failed, then what is the amount of time it will be waiting? So minimum is 100 ms, maximum backoff 10 seconds. It is the maximum time for which it can wait. Okay, now in the metadata configs, these are the configs that belongs to your metadata. Okay, that is coming with your samples. Okay, now let us come to the read part. Okay, what happens in case of read part? As we discussed, the data flows from your remote storage to the Prometheus. Okay, so again, in the URI for Prometheus, you will tell Prometheus, okay, from which API it will read. Like in our last example, it was Promescale, then port number, and then slash read. So that was the endpoint. Okay, remote timeout, again the timeout at which if your remote is not reachable, it will be considered as unhealthy. Okay, and you'll get the exception of remote timeout. Read recent basically specifies to read the recent values that is inside the remote data. Okay, now follow redirects, it will directs the it will follow the redirects whichever is set up. Enable HTTP, again HTTP2 is again the same. Now filter external labels, it will filter the external labels that are associated with your metrics. Okay, so this was about the remote write and remote read configuration. Now with this you'll be able to relate the last lecture where we have set up the promise scale storage actually. So I hope you were able to understand the logic and what are these configurations, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you.